We'll be looking really closely at what the original texts and the historical records actually say. Okay, let's dive right into this. We're going to explore 5 essential layers today. First up, the forgotten ordinance. Then, authority and headship order. After that, we'll unpack the theology of glory, look at a really interesting section called Because of the Angels, and finally, we'll wrap things up by answering some modern objections. All right, Section 1, the forgotten ordinance. We're going to kick things off by looking at the historical context of how a nearly universal Christian practice seemingly vanished almost overnight.
Okay, so the sources highlight a truly shocking historical reality here. For roughly 1900 years, literally from the 1st century all the way up to around 1920, the practice of women covering their heads in worship was virtually universal across Christian denominations. But then, between the 1920s and the 60s, there was this massive, sharp decline. The source material attributes this abrupt end to sweeping cultural shifts. We're talking about Hollywood pushing moral boundaries, women rapidly entering the workforce during the World Wars, and early feminist movements, like the floppers. Fast forward to today, though, and we're seeing a modern revival, as people are starting to rediscover this lost history. But you might be wondering what exactly was lost. Well, proponents emphasize that when the Apostle Paul wrote about traditions or ordinances in 1 Corinthians 11, he actually used a very specific Greek word that implies a handed-down apostolic command directly from the Lord. So the sources argue that this means the head covering wasn't just some localized cultural custom meant for one specific city. No, it was an authoritative command meant to be kept universally by the global church. Moving right along to Section 2, Authority and Headship Order. Let's see how this builds as we explore the foundational pillar of the headship argument. The explainer sources detail what they view as God's unchangeable governmental order of authority, and it flows perfectly down this very specific hierarchy. First God, then Christ, then man, and finally woman. The core argument here is that this sequence isn't just arbitrary. It actually reflects a permanent order in how God governs the world, and it specifically dictates how men and women are supposed to visually present themselves in worship to honor that order. Now, this theological argument is anchored directly in the Genesis creation sequence. Reading straight from 1 Corinthians 11, it says, "For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man." The sources argue that because this headship order was established prior to the fall of humanity, it remains completely intact today. It wasn't just canceled out by redemption. Instead, the head covering acts as a visible, physical symbol of a woman willingly submitting to this God-ordained arrangement. All right, Section 3, the theology of glory. Next up, we're going to examine a highly abstract but absolutely crucial biblical concept as it relates to corporate worship. The sources untangle this by looking at what they call the theology of rival glories, and it sets up this really stark contrast. Basically, the man is the image and glory of God, meaning God's glory is on display through him, so his head absolutely must remain completely uncovered in worship. Conversely, the woman is the glory of man, and her natural hair is her personal glory. So the sources argue that in a worship gathering, only God's glory should take center stage, right? Therefore, a woman veils her hair to essentially cover up any competing human glories, ensuring that God alone receives the attention. According to the sources, bringing competing human glories into the assembly actually violates God's order. The text reads, "For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short, let her cover her head." So the texts are arguing that an unveiled head is essentially equated to the absolute disgrace of a shaved head in nature. It's basically presented as an all-or-nothing argument. If you refuse to cover your glory with a veil, you might as well just shave off the natural glory of your hair entirely. Okay, on to Section 4, Because of the Angels. We are now introducing perhaps the most mysterious theological pillar supporting the head covering practice, which is the presence of angels. Now, what's really fascinating here is how the text points to an unseen, spiritual audience that is actively observing our corporate worship. The scripture explicitly states that is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, because of the angels. So let's just neutrally unpack what this actually means based on the source material. First, angels are active witnesses to our prayer and prophecy. Second, they are highly regimented in ranks and authority themselves. Third, they revere God's glory alone in worship. In fact, they often cover themselves in God's presence. And finally, early church fathers believed angels are highly concerned with human modesty to prevent stumbling, and they trace this all the way back to the events of Genesis 6. So basically, the covering is framed as an act of reverence and proper hierarchical order for this heavenly audience.
And that brings us to Section 5, answering modern objections. Finally, we arrive at the most common modern pushbacks against head coverings and exactly how the source material deconstructs them. So here is the first really big question posed by the sources. Was this just a cultural rule about Corinthian prostitutes? I mean, this is by far the most frequently asked question. This idea that Paul was merely trying to keep Christian women from looking like local street workers. Well, the sources actually call this the prostitute myth. They impartially trace this super popular theory back to a 19th century theologian named Adam Clarke, who allegedly fabricated it entirely out of thin air. In reality, the historical evidence presented shows that standard Greek women actually prayed unveiled. Therefore, Paul's command for women to veil themselves wasn't conforming to local culture at all. It was completely countercultural and incredibly radical for the time. Okay, here's another major objection. Is a woman's naturally long hair her only required covering? A lot of people read the passage and conclude that hair itself is the singular covering that Paul was referring to. But the crucial point here, according to the sources, is actually found right in the original Greek language. In verses 1 through 14, Paul uses the word katakalupto, which means to carefully veil or cover over completely with fabric. But when you look down at verse 15, when he's talking about hair, he uses a completely different word, paraboleon, which translates to a mantle or natural wrapper. So the sources argue that Paul deliberately used distinct words to differentiate a physical cloth veil from natural hair. And to really solidify this historical reading, the sources cite the early church father Tertullian, who is writing around 200 AD. He noted, "At this day the Corinthians do veil their virgins. What the apostles taught, the disciples approve." The sources use this to prove that 150 years after Paul's letter, Corinthian women were quite literally veiling themselves with physical cloth, perfectly following the apostles' original intent. Now let's tackle one final objection. Whether this covering is exclusively for the exercise of active charismatic gifts. In other words, does this command only apply if someone is actively speaking in tongues or prophesying out loud in the service? The sources clarify this by explaining that the phrase praying and prophesying functions as a synecdoche. Now, if you're not familiar, that's just a figure of speech where a part represents the whole, kind of like saying, "let's take my wheels," when you actually mean your entire car. Because women were instructed elsewhere by Paul to remain silent in the church, this phrase actually refers to their general participation in the overall corporate worship service. So the argument is that the covering applies to the entire gathering. And this brings us to a final, really provocative question to end our explainer today. How much does our modern culture subconsciously influence our reading of ancient texts? You know, when we see a massive gap between 1900 years of historic practice and our modern interpretation, it really challenges us to ask if we are reading the text for what it plainly says or for what our modern sensibilities are comfortable with. It's an absolutely fascinating tension between historic practice and modern interpretation, and it definitely leaves us with plenty to explore and reflect on. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive.